We are back with a Fox News alert overnight. We are back with a Fox News alert overnight. 32 people killed and nearly 200 hurt during a stampede at the funeral for Iran's top military leader killed by a U.S. airstrike.
This comes as Iran's Revolutionary Guard says it will set ablaze places supported by the United States, while that country designates the American military as a terror organization.
The United States now warning ships across the Middle East of, quote, the possibility of Iranian action against U.S. maritime interests.
All right, let's bring in the ambassador, White House National Security Advisor, Robert O'Brien. As you can see, he's on the North Lawn at the White House. Ambassador, good morning to you.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good to be with you.
Tell us about these new threats.
Well, look, these threats have been around for 40 years, ever since the Iranian Revolution took place. The Iranian regime has been threatening shipping interests, has been threatening Americans, has been taking hostages, and has been attacking their neighbors. So this is nothing new, but we're watching it carefully, and we've sent a very strong message to the Iranian regime that we're not going to tolerate it.
Ambassador, does this have to do with the imminent intel that they had gathered last week that wound up having the president pull the trigger on General Soleimani?
You know, the president has always made it his first priority to protect American citizens, and the intel that we had, the information we had, which we believe was very strong, showed that Soleimani and those he was plotting with were looking to kill American diplomats and soldiers in significant numbers in the coming days. And that's why the president authorized the successful operation that was undertaken by the U.S. military.
Absolutely. Oh, go ahead.
Ambassador, the president was tweeting this. He said Iran will never have a nuclear weapon. How does the death of this terrorist general change our path in keeping Iran from getting a nuclear bomb?
Well, Soleimani was heavily involved from the early days in the Iranian nuclear program. He was sanctioned by the UN. In fact, he was not supposed to be traveling outside of Iran under UN sanctions because of his role in the nuclear program. So we think it'll have an effect. We also believe it peace through strength, and it was a deterrent to future Iranian action that has been prescribed by the UN and by the international community.
Mr. Ambassador, we know that this president ran on scrapping the Iran deal, which he did. And we knew the Iranians were cheating on it before, and they're certainly cheating on it now. They used the death of the terrorist Soleimani as an excuse, as a justification to pretend like they weren't cheating on it. Now they say they're blowing right through the parameters of the deal. What specifically has changed as far as the White House's approach toward Iran to enforce what the president tweeted, that they will never get a nuclear bomb if they are really going to sprint now to try to get one?
Well, I can tell you, we've been in touch with our friends and allies in Europe and in the region, and there is absolutely zero appetite in the international community for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That won't happen. There are UN resolutions against Iran having a nuclear weapon. The Non-Proliferation Treaty prohibits them from getting a nuclear weapon, and we think there's going to be a broad consensus.
But the UN's never going to
Iran.
enforce that, Mr. Ambassador. You know that. The UN doesn't drop bombs to enforce things. They write resolutions that are ultimately meaningless if someone doesn't step up. Is the U.S. prepared in any means necessary to stop that?
I think the president made it very clear that Iran will not have a nuclear weapon, and I think we've got a lot of friends and allies both in the region and in Europe who are committed to that outcome.
Speaking of the United Nations, Mr. Ambassador, on Thursday there's going to be a UN Security Council meeting. The Foreign Minister Zarif from Iran wanted to go, but apparently last night the U.S. State Department denied his visa. Why is that?
I don't think Secretary Pompeo thought that this was the right time for Mr. Zarif to come to the United States, and whenever he comes to New York, he spreads propaganda. I actually find it somewhat ironic that Mr. Zarif wants to take advantage of the diplomatic niceties of being able to come to New York and come to the UN when his revolution was born in the taking of 52 American diplomats hostage in Iran and holding them for 444 days. You know, that undermined every principle of diplomacy, and the Iranians, that's how they started their revolution, is by taking diplomats hostage. So I think he'll be fine missing that meeting. He can certainly call into the meeting, or he can participate by video teleconference, and his voice will be heard if he wants to be heard.
Yeah, before the revolution, women didn't have to cover their faces. They were highly educated. Ben Rhodes, who was He was Deputy National Security Advisor under President Obama. He says that voting for President Trump is dangerous to our national security. This is what he tweeted. He said, "We have a president in the midst of a full meltdown during a major crisis of his own making. A vote for this man is dangerous for our national security." What are your thoughts?
Well, my thoughts are, Ben Rhodes was a communications guy in the Obama administration, and that was his job, was to do strict political communication for the president. In my last job, I spent 2 years bringing back hostages, most of whom were taken in the prior administration. And as those of you in the media who followed it know, I made it my policy not to criticize the prior administration. I'm not going to criticize the Obama administration today, but I'm going to say that we have a fundamental disagreement with Ben Rhodes and people who think like Ben Rhodes. The president believes that weakness is provocative, and I think we've seen that throughout history. We believe in peace through strength, like Ronald Reagan did. It's something that's been a cornerstone of President Trump's foreign policy and national security policy. We believe a strong America deters our aggressors. We believe a weak America and an America that's willing to appease our aggressors invites more violence against American citizens. And so we're committed to a peace through strength foreign policy. And that's just a fundamental disagreement that we have with Ben Rhodes. And there are people that take a different view. He's certainly one of them.
All right. And Ambassador, before you leave, from the intel, and you mentioned a moment ago that some of that imminent intel involved Iranian interests striking out at American diplomats in that region. I think that's something we had not heard before. What else can you tell us about that?
Well, I can tell you that there were plans that were being made and that Soleimani was in the midst of that plotting. That's why he was traveling in the region to Damascus and Beirut and Baghdad to conspire with people to attack American facilities that contain diplomats, soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines, and Coast Guardmen. So the president was very concerned about that activity. Soleimani and the Iranian regime knew exactly what they were doing. And what I think they did is they underestimated the president and his restraint. I mean, they downed several drones. They'd attacked Aramco. They'd been involved in a number of indirect fire incidents on our facilities over the last several months. And the president's been very restrained. And they took that restraint and that goodwill as the president tried to open negotiations with the Iranians. Remember, he offered to speak with them unconditionally. Mm-hmm. They took that as a sign of weakness. I think they understand now that this president means business, and they made a bad mistake in how they read his restraint, which was admirable.
Yep, Soleimani was not on a friendship tour around the Middle East, that's for sure. Thank you very much. Mr. Ambassador, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.